What do you think about Mearsheimer? Man, I don't want to... This video is like an hour long. Let's just watch this for like 10 minutes so that I can eat some protein bars, because I'm getting hungry. I'm getting hungry right now, okay?
All right. Am I...
So this is in 2015. This is after the people of Ukraine ousted the prior corrupt pro-Russian government and then held an election, had a new guy, and now the 2014, you know, whole Donbass separatist bullshit is happening. But it's 7 years before.
My University of Chicago, the student organization that I co-founded in 1988.
Talk a little bit about the West's response so far to the crisis, which is just, in my opinion, making a bad situation worse, and tell you what I think should be done, and then finally wrap up with some discussion of the consequences. So let me start with some preliminary comments. First, with regard to America's...
Also, I don't think I've ever called Chomsky a tanky.
Core strategic interests. For me, core strategic interests are areas of the world where you're willing to fight and die. And in my opinion, outside of the Western Hemisphere, which is of enormous strategic importance to us, there are only 3 areas of the world that really matter. 1 is Europe, 2 is Northeast Asia, and 3 is the Persian Gulf. And it's very important to understand that since this country got its independence in 1783, Europe has been the most important area of the world. Even though the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, we had a Europe first policy going into the war. We're at 1.2
speed already.
We had a Europe first policy throughout the war. And it's in large part because the great powers in Europe are more important than the great powers in Northeast Asia over time. Of course, the Persian Gulf was an important area because that's where the oil is, and oil is a critical resource that matters greatly in the international system. So those are the 3 most important areas outside the Western Hemisphere. And again, since the beginning of this country, Europe has been number 1.
We are up to 1.3.
You want to understand that we're undergoing a fundamental shift of great importance. Asia, because of the rise of China, is going to be the most important area of the world for the United States. And Poland is right. States. This one says, if you very difficult for us, broke out on February. Henry Kissinger and maybe a handful of other people, they're to the West. The way we are in the process of, or if you're part of the leadership in Beijing, don't like that in getting leaders who are pro-American. But again, you can see the strategy here: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting democracy. Say a bit more about NATO expansion because it's so important. NATO expansion took place in 2 tranches. The first one was in 1999. That's when you get Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary incorporated into NATO. The second big tranche was in 2004. And that's when the Baltic states, you can see Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania up top, Romania, Bulgaria, these are the light brown countries. That's the second tranche of NATO expansion. Now, the Soviets made it clear from the mid-1990s they were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion. But number 1, they were too weak to do anything about it. And 2, it didn't involve the states that were right on their border. I mean, there's no question, as you can see from the map, that Latvia and Estonia are on Russia's border, and Lithuania as well, if you want to include that little enclave between Poland and Lithuania. But the fact is, these were very small states. It was early in the game, and the Russians were willing to live with it. But then the big trouble starts. And it comes in the famous Bucharest Summit, NATO's Bucharest Summit in April 2008, where at the end of the summit, a declaration is issued which says, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO.
If only.
The Soviets, the Russians made this perfectly clear. This was unacceptable. Russia's deputy foreign minister said, Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake, which will have most serious consequences for pan-European security.
What a slimy fucking rat, dude. From Russia's deputy foreign minister, hey, Ukraine and Georgia's decisions to join NATO will have serious consequences for pan-European security. Mafia bullshit.
Putin himself said, Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. You all remember that there was a war between Russia and Georgia in August 2008? That war was a consequence of this, because the Georgians thought we were sending them a signal that they could get uppity with the Russians and we would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. That's not what happened. And you know what happened. The Russians clobbered the Georgians, and Georgia is in deep trouble today because it thought it could become part of NATO. So you want to remember that April 2008 summit, very important. That declaration, very important. And then what happens is you have a war. So those are the deep causes, those three strategies: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting democracy. What about the precipitating cause? The key events leading up to the coup. It's the coup of February 22nd, 2014 that's of enormous importance. That's what really throws the crisis into gear. Just think about that word, coup.
Man, I gotta say, dude, it really is, like, insane how much of the modern left is brain rotted by Russian propaganda. It's actually fucking wild. It's unbelievable. This video is 6 million views, by the way. Calling it a coup is a big RT red flag, by the way. We'll get there.
Orange Revolution, promoting democracy, the coup, February 22nd, 2014. So the question is, what causes the coup?
So I don't like the term coup here, because a coup usually implies that a rival political bloc within a country takes over, but that's not what happened. They ousted a corrupt leader who was killing protesters, and then they held another election. They didn't oust all of Parliament. They didn't force their own leader in. In that respect, it's actually a pretty remarkable political event. The idea of protesters rising up not to install their own government, but rather to oust one corrupt leader and then allowing the pre-existing democratic process to continue. There was an interim leader, though. Yeah, but that interim leader wasn't like some crazy dictator or some like massive ideologue who like fucked over the system in favor of his people or whatever. It was honestly a pretty cool thing what happened. Not to say it was perfect, but... No, why'd you mute that person? I saw they were complaining about me. Hold on. Stalk. Night. Invalid query. They got muted? No, they'll say it again in 3 minutes.
Starts in November of 2013. At that point, Yanukovych, President Yanukovych, who's the head of Ukraine, is negotiating with the EU to form an association agreement that brings the EU and Ukraine much closer together. It's a step in the direction of incorporating Ukraine into the European Union, or to put it in slightly...
Wait, Vosh, does this mean you're not an isolationist then? If so, that's base as fuck. I'm not an isolationist at all. 0%, okay? The world has already been carved up by superpowers. Geopolitics is not going to be made better for America's absence. It will only be made less American. The goal is to constrain the worst excesses of our foreign policy while promoting the things that matter. And in this case, all we're doing is selling arms to an allied country about to be invaded, which to me seems like a pretty hands-off way of responding to the situation.
Different terms incorporating Ukraine into the West. The Russians make it clear that this is unacceptable. The Russians are willing to do a deal that involves the EU, Russia, the IMF, and Ukraine. But the idea that Ukraine is going to do a deal exclusively with the EU and the Russians are going to be left out in the cold is not something that Putin is willing to countenance. He puts significant pressure on the Ukrainians. He offers them a terrific deal. And as you can imagine, the EU is not offering Ukraine a particularly good deal, because you know how much corruption there is in Ukraine. And the EU wants Ukraine to eliminate that corruption, which the Ukrainians really don't want to do. So what Putin does is not only make it clear that that deal is not going to happen, but he offers a sweetheart deal of his own. So Yanukovych, on November 21st, says no to the EU. This leads to a series of protests. The Ukrainian government, truth be told, under Yanukovych, overreacts to the protests, which causes them to spiral out of control. And in January of 2014, you can see there, January 27, 2000.
Bit of an understatement. He tried to pass down hyper-authoritarian laws that would have turned it into a police state. So that was bad.
In 2014, you have your first 2 deaths in the protests. These are the Maidan protests. And then in the February 18th through February 20th time period, lots of people die. It's really messy. And what happened?
I really like how the street clashes bit here never actually says the number of protesters killed. It just says clashes leave X number of people dead. You know, the conflict between Germany and Poland left millions dead.
What happens is that a number of European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign minister, they fly to Kiev, and a deal is worked out to have elections that will, in effect, remove Yanukovych from power.
The laws were identical to laws used in the US and the ones in Canada. You react to them differently. I'm permanently banning you. I don't care if that was a joke. Was that a joke? I don't care. Go read up the laws if you want to. I can't believe that's so fucking disrespectful. Jesus fucking Christ. You can look them up if you want, man. They were insane. You guys remember we were looking them up when we were talking to that guy, the one who I screamed at? Wait, I'm not gonna ban. I'm not gonna ban. Because I'm not like Putin. I'm better than that. Wait, I might ban this person. Vosh, I really think your takes to Ukraine are really fucking bad. It's so clear the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk want to secede from the Ukraine. You guys should be helping them, but instead you're just super handsome and your hair looks really floofy today. You're playing with fire, Rainbow. You're all playing with fire. You know that? These are dangerous times to be a chatter. Two most dangerous places in the world right now. Number 2, Donbass region. Number 1, VGG. Now you keep that in mind.
But the protesters refused to accept the deal. And there are significant fascist elements among the protesters.
Oh my
who are
God.
armed, right? There's killing on the Maidan. And as a result, Yanukovych flees for his life to Russia. And this all happens on February 22nd.
Oh my fucking God.
And so here are the key events after the coup. On February 23rd.
That's all he's saying about the so-called coup. Nothing about police crackdowns, nothing about the fact that Russia was telling the Ukrainian leader to kill protesters and crack down harder. Nothing about the laws they were trying to pass. Nothing about the number of protesters who died. Nothing about the fact that it was an overwhelming, like, popular ousting of the... Nothing about the snipers. Just, yeah, nothing. Just whatever. Just, yeah, leader fled for his life. How do people listen to this shit and not think...
Parliament votes to repeal minority language laws in the East. This is basically the Russian language.
Okay, this stuff is bad, by the way. There was a massive nationalist reaction, which led to the legitimate suppression of East Ukrainians who were considered more Russian-aligned after the fact. I will not defend this.
And then on February 27th, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints in the Crimea. On the 28th, additional Russian forces begin moving into the Crimea. The Russians didn't conquer or invade Crimea. Actually, the Russians didn't invade Crimea. They were already there because they had a leasing agreement. There's a naval base at Sevastopol, and the Russians were leasing that naval base from Ukraine. So they had military forces there. So when it says Russian units begin seizing checkpoints on the 27th, those were Russian units that were already there. Then additional Russian forces begin moving in on the 28th. And then on the 6th, the 16th, and the 18th, you have a scenario, you have a handful of events that lead to Russia incorporating Crimea.
A handful of events that lead to them incorporating. Jesus fuck, dude.
After that, conflict breaks out in eastern Ukraine. And although we do not have a lot of hard evidence that the Russians are physically involved in eastern Ukraine, I think it's quite clear that they are physically involved, that there are Russian troops there. How many is very hard to tell from the outside. I think it's very clear that the Russian government is going to great lengths to make sure that those pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine are capable of maintaining a certain amount of independence. And I'll talk more about this in a second. Okay, understanding the Russian response. What is the Russian response? 2 parts. First is they took Crimea and they're not giving it back. Crimea is gone. Second is what they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer.
Wait, then why did we go into Afghanistan after Russia failed? Wait, you really think that a nation state wouldn't try and engage in unsustainable imperialist conquest just because history shows they can't? Hitler invaded Russia.
Conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that. What Putin is doing is he's basically in the process of wrecking Ukraine, and he's telling the West in very simple terms, you have 2 choices. You either back.
The international school of thought the international relations school of thought this guy subscribes to, it sounds to me like he's basically doing the IR version of, like, economics 101. The idea of, like, everyone is like a rational agent, and by rational agent we don't mean acting in self-interest, we actually mean acting to optimize self-interest based on, like, perfect information or whatever. Realism school of thought. Neo-realist, it's all about rational choice. Listen, here's the thing you gotta understand. And I'm right, like always, okay? Are you ready for it? It's that no matter how much they try to convince you this isn't the case, okay? Everyone in power is a fucking psychopath. They're not smart, at least not as a rule. They're not rational, at least not as a rule, okay? Countries are kept more or less stable simply through the fact that there are a lot of them who hold the keys to power, okay? That's it. It's as simple as that. Because having a balancing force with thousands of different corporate leaders, elected leaders, non-elected leaders, military leaders, who all have conflicting interests, keeps something a little bit stable. But the fewer and fewer people are on the top, the more and more, unstable it grows. And Russia does not have a tremendous number of people at the top. So to be clear, you believe people are naturally irrational? Depends on your definition of rational. If by rational you mean in the economic sense, attempting to maximize self-interest, then I do believe humans are naturally rational. If you're talking about, do I think that humans will naturally come to the best conclusions? No. Not even close. Oh my God, no. You couldn't possibly believe that after doing my job. Or watching me do my job, to be honest with you. We very obviously, the vast majority of people are brain fucked. I don't think people in power are any different. They might be more ambitious and maybe more intelligent, but I don't think they're any less brain fucked.
Off, right? And we go back to the status quo ante before February 22nd, 2014, where Ukraine is a buffer state, or you continue to play these games where you try and take Ukraine and make it a Western bastion on our doorstep, in which case we'll wreck the country. And they are, of course, now in the process of wrecking it, right? And they're going to keep this conflict going for as long as they have to. That's the basic game here. Again, two steps. One, took Crimea. No way they're going to ever let Crimea become a NATO base. And remember, the name of the game here is to make Ukraine part of NATO. Not happening. And they're not getting Crimea. We've taken Crimea, we're keeping it. Number one. And number two, you want a frozen conflict or you want to wreck Ukraine so that it can't become part of the West. Question number two here is what motivates this? What motivates this is that Russia...
Okay, I'll say one more thing, okay? You know what you guys need to do? Read historical articles detailing the life, the mind, and the thoughts of European monarchs. Okay? Now, European monarchs were, for their time, literally the most educated people. Period. They were raised by tutors from birth and had a court of well-kept, scholarly academics who would inform them nonstop. These people were psychopaths. They were fucking psychopaths. Thank God they didn't have nukes. Thank fuck they didn't have nukes, okay? Even if you take away them being inbred or whatever, even the people who didn't have, like, congenital problems, they were insane. They were insane. Absolutely fucking psychotic, man.
Is a great power, and it has absolutely no interest in allowing the United States and its allies to take a big piece of real estate of great strategic importance on its western border and incorporate it into the West. This should be hardly surprising to the United States of America.
Keeping up with any updates posted in chat.
The Monroe Doctrine basically says that the Western Hemisphere is our backyard, and nobody from a distant region is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. I can tell from looking at the audience that most of you are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis like I am. You remember how we went stark raving crazy at the idea of the Soviets putting military...
What IR school of thought do you subscribe to? The correct one.
Military forces in Cuba. This is unacceptable. Nobody puts military forces in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Can you imagine 20 years from now a powerful China forming a military alliance with Canada and Mexico and moving Chinese military forces onto Canadian and Mexican soil, and us just standing there and saying, this is no problem. We're all 21st century people, and worrying about Chinese forces there is what 19th century people like Vladimir Putin worry about. Of course that's not going to happen. We're going to maintain the Monroe Doctrine with regard to China just as we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So nobody should be surprised that the Russians were apoplectic about the idea of us putting Ukraine...
He's correct here in that Americans would probably react to that the same way Putin has reacted to NATO moving closer to Russia's borders, but it would still be wrong. It would still be unacceptable, because they could never invade us. If any country ever engaged in a land invasion of America, we would glass the planet. The world would end. Like, you know?
On the western side of the ledger. And by the way, they told us, I gave you the quotes, in the wake of the Bucharest Summit. I told you what happened in August 2008 with the Georgia War. The precedents were there. The rhetoric was there.
Oh, and the equivalent here would be, the equivalent here would be us invading Canada because we've heard talks where China might want to put, like, their own defensive pact there.
They told us, but we did not stop our efforts to make Ukraine part of the West.
Realism is descriptive and not prescriptive. Yeah, this is why I got out of political science, because nothing infuriates me more than people whose language is chock full of biases, acting as though the information they're delivering is simply an impartial, straightforward analysis of the situation. That shit pisses me off. The framing this guy has used has been slanted in a number of very notable ways, but the theory of international relations he's employing is supposed to be purely descriptive. So he shouldn't have any biases in how he presents it. It should just be a statement of fact as is. But in reality, descriptive statements can be prescriptive by implication. Framing what happened in Ukraine as a coup rather than an ousting of a dictator, talking about how people died rather than police killed protesters. You can frame information in a way which is factually correct, but still presents an implied prescriptive bias. And that's the problem that I take with attitudes like this. And funnily, this is one of the things that critical race theory and critical legal studies are meant to address: the false presumption of unbiased analysis in the legal system. The idea that you're being simply impartial and descriptive when you go over like legal documentation because, it's just a fact of the law. It's the same bullshit that people like Amy Coney Barrett do when they talk about how they were constitutional originalist, Like, oh yeah, dude, I don't have any political biases. It's just a complete coincidence that all of my expressed political positions are conservative and that all of my objective interpretations of the original will of the founding fathers lead me to conservative conclusions. Bro, it's just a coincidence, dog. Dude, it's just like a coincidence. I fucking hate that shit, dude. There's no such thing as a purely descriptive form of political engagement. Everything is prescriptive, either by implication or explicitly. And I prefer explicitly because I'm not a coward, personally.
And the Russians responded. Was it surprising? For some reason, President Obama and virtually all of the elites in the West were surprised. I guess this is because they're 21st century people, right? And they think that balance of power politics doesn't matter anymore. If you think these people in Washington and most Americans are having trouble dealing with the Russians, you can't believe how much trouble we're going to have with the Chinese. I'm very popular in China. I go to China quite often. And I usually start my talks by saying it's good to be back among my people, because when I'm in China, I'm intellectually much more at home there than I am in Washington, because in Beijing, much like in Moscow, you're dealing with 19th century people like me. Whereas in Washington, you're dealing with 21st century people. I think the Chinese are going to eat our lunch, right? Talk about the conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is that Putin is the main cause of the crisis. Some say he's either crazy or irrational. Angela Merkel was making this argument for a while. He's bent on creating a greater Russia. And
I think the language he's using here indicates that he believes Moscow and Beijing are both full of scholars and politicians who adhere to older doctrines of geopolitical engagement, spheres of power, that sort of thing. Whereas America has gone past that idea somewhat.
Bears marked resemblance to Adolf Hitler. Say a few words about each of these. I know a great deal about Adolf Hitler. I've written and I teach extensively on Nazi Germany's behavior in the 30s and during World War II. The idea that he bears any resemblance to Adolf Hitler is laughable in the extreme. It's hard to believe that serious people make that argument. The idea that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, I think if he could do it, he'd do it. He can't do it. Russia's a declining great power. And as I said to you before, if they were to try and create a greater Russia by invading Ukraine and by invading the Baltic states, they'd be jumping into the briar patch. In fact, again, if you want to...
But Adolf Hitler jumped into the briar patch. Wait, you're saying Putin wouldn't engage in these invasions because they'd be unsustainable and his economy would falter. That's what happened to Adolf Hitler. He did that too. He had a few successful invasions, and then the economy stalled, and his, forces got pushed back. Yeah, Mussolini did too. Authoritarians with expansionist aims actually quite often overreach and cause quite a bit of damage doing so.
Wreck Russia, what you should do is tell them to try and create a greater Russia. It will lead to no end of trouble. I think Putin is much too smart for that, and he is in the process of wrecking Ukraine. I want to make that clear. And he's wrecking Ukraine because he's basically saying to the West, you can't have it, and I'll wreck it before you take it. Is he crazy or irrational? I don't think so. I think he's very strategic. And I don't think he's the main cause of the crisis, as I said to you. Another set of arguments associated with the conventional wisdom. This is that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, seeking to promote stability in Asia, all over the globe, and so forth and so on. There are some countries like Japan and Germany, for sure, Poland, who view the United States as a benign hegemon. There are many countries out there who do not. Iran is one, China is another, and Russia is a third. They just don't see it that way. And because they don't see it that way, you should understand that when you take measures, you meaning the United States, that you think are going to be interpreted as benign, the other side will not see them that way.
This is just a straw man that gets brought up a lot in conversation with lefties, but I don't think anyone reasonable are suggesting that Ukraine being a part of NATO wouldn't be an extension of American geopolitical power. Like, obviously. But the point here is, if you're talking about this ethically, what Ukraine wants should be what Ukraine gets. And if Ukraine wants to be aligned more with the EU and a part of NATO and also not to be fucking invaded, then that should be something that we promote. But yeah, it's the argument isn't that like America is benign and Russia is evil. Both are acting in their own self-interest, arguably. But one's self-interest in this case is much less destructive to people.
See them as threatening. This gets back to my point about democracy promotion. We believe democracy promotion is an unalloyed.
Political realists like this guy don't care about ethics. They say they don't care about ethics. They pretend they don't care about ethics. But the language this guy is employing is very obviously slanted in a way which gives people greater prescriptive power in some directions over others. That's the point.
Good. And we can't understand why people like Putin and the leaders in Beijing don't understand this, but they don't understand it. And if you don't recognize what other people think, you're incapable of putting yourself in their shoes, you're going to get yourself into a heck of a lot of trouble. And of course, that's exactly what happened here. And then another argument is that Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try.
Ethics don't matter in geopolitics, tough. Actually, I think that ethics matter in literally all things that everyone does when it comes to making prescriptive statements, because prescriptive statements and ethics are kind of, well, they're really close together. They're very, very well aligned, actually. So what? So lefties should never make any statements on geopolitics? Our invasion of Iraq? Like, we shouldn't say that's wrong? Like, come on.
To include Ukraine and Georgia, right? What's very interesting is that there is no evidence that we thought Putin was aggressive before the crisis. There's no evidence that we thought that. There's no evidence that we were talking about expanding NATO because we had to contain the Russians. Because again, NATO expansion was driven by 21st century men and women. They believe balance of power politics is dead. That's what happened here.
What? No, this is literally just bullshit. At this point, Russia had already engaged in multiple adjacent crackdowns. This feels incoherent to me.
Do you understand? Putin is a 19th century man. Right. He does view the world in terms of balance of power politics, as do we when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. But in this case, in the case of Europe, we were thinking like 21st century men and women. And we thought that we could just drive right up to his doorstep and it wouldn't matter. Right? We did not think that Russia was aggressive. What happened here is that after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, we then decided that Russia was aggressive. We then decided that Russia was bent on creating a greater Russia.
See, if he was actually only concerned with a realist analysis of the situation, then why is he so insistent on framing Western concerns on this issue as two-faced, inconsistent, naive, and contradictory? If he was only describing what people are and what they did, then it wouldn't be framed in this package, which is very clearly trying to, like, the literal title of the video is, why is Ukraine the West's fault? This is an ethical question. Like, this is direct. Like, this isn't just some straight-faced, unbiased delivery of information. This is a narrative being constructed. Anyone who believes otherwise is a dupe.
It was after the fact. By the way, this is.
It's clearly biased, but don't you admit you're biased in this argument as well? Yeah, absolutely. I've never pretended that I'm not biased. I'm crazy biased. But in this respect, I think I'm right. And I think that his biases are meant to deliver a particular political agenda, whereas my biases in this case aren't contradicting existing evidence. But some of the shit he's saying here is just, like, pretty bad. Have I watched Babby's First International Relations by Historia Civilius? No, I have not. Do you recommend it?
This is why President Obama and virtually all of Washington was caught with their pants down when this crisis broke out after February 22nd, because they did not see it coming. Talk a little bit about our response. We're basically doubling down. We're getting tougher and tougher with the Russians. That's our strategy. And that's exactly what you'd expect if you're going to blame them, given that we're incapable.
If you're gonna blame them for their military incursion.
Blaming ourselves because we never do anything wrong. You all know that. All the problems in the world are caused by everybody else, never by the United States, because we're a benign hegemon. Well, if we're the good guys and they're the bad guys and they're misbehaving, they're bent on creating a greater Russia, oh my God, this is the 1930s all over again. Any sort of concession to Putin is Munich, October 1938. You can't do that, so what you do is you double down. You get tougher and tougher. Then this brings us to the question of whether we can succeed or not.
These are straw men.
Because you're playing a losing hand. Right? And the reason you're playing a losing hand is because this is a competition between economic considerations and security considerations. The basic mindset of people in the West is that you can punish the Russians economically and they'll throw their hands up. My argument is when security considerations are at stake, when core strategic interests are at stake, and there's no question, ladies and gentlemen, in Russia's case, this is a core strategic interest, countries will suffer enormously before they throw their hands up.
That's not untrue, but notice how he's not saying what we did in response, only that we're doubling down, and B, he's not being clear what he means when he says core strategic threat, because he still hasn't made it clear the objective fact that NATO cannot invade Russia.
Right. So you can inflict a lot of pain on the Russians, and they're not going to quit. And they're not going to quit because Ukraine matters to them. And by the way, Ukraine doesn't matter to us. You understand there's nobody calling for us to fight in Ukraine. Even John McCain, who up until recently has never seen a war he didn't want to fight, right, is not calling for using military force in Ukraine.
Yeah, nobody wants to.
What John McCain is saying is that Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the West. That's what he's saying. It is a vital strategic interest for the Russians. They've made that perfectly clear.
That's a misreading. Hold on. Whoa. That is wrong in his own framework. Just because America isn't willing to commit troops to Ukraine does not mean it's not a vital strategic interest. What if it's because Russian troops are closer and we both have nukes? Two countries can both have a strategic interest in the same region, but one country must know that they can't get directly involved because doing so would be brinksmanship between two nuclear powers. That does not track within the framework that he's put forward.
And not just Putin, right? So in terms of the balance of resolve, it's all on their side. And I showed you that slide up there that depicted how much economic leverage the Russians have because of all that natural gas going westward.
We skipped that bit, but they do have quite a lot.
We're playing a losing hand here. But let's assume that I'm wrong. Let's assume that we're playing a winning hand and that we are capable of...
Realists don't account for nukes because they literally have a 19th century mindset. Oh, God, you might be right.
Backing Putin into a corner. And we're getting close to pushing him off a cliff. Is this good? You're talking about a country that's got thousands of nuclear weapons.
Oh.
The only circumstance, really, under which states use nuclear weapons is when they're desperate, when they think their survival is at stake.
That's true.
So what you're talking about is putting Putin in a situation where he's desperate. And if you go home and Google Putin and nuclear brinksmanship, you'll be reading all the articles that come up for the next 2 years, right? Because he's making it clear that you're fooling around with his core strategic interests. And again, he's got thousands of nuclear weapons. So you're putting yourself in a position, right? You're putting yourself in a position where you're willing to risk a possible nuclear war over a piece of real estate, Ukraine, that is not of vital strategic interest to the United States. Again, it's not.
So what are we supposed to do? If this is the framework that you have, piece of real estate, if the framework you have then is like just you can never, ever, ever fuck with Russia because they'll just nuke everyone. This is appeasement. He said earlier that this isn't appeasement and it's totally not like Hitler, but I'm failing to understand how this isn't appeasement. Essentially, just hope that he will stop doing the bad thing.
Not of vital strategic interest to us. By the way, this will be my final point on this. What's truly amazing about all of this is that we were talking about incorporating Ukraine into NATO.
That is the conclusion, establishing spheres of influence. Okay, listen, I need you guys to understand this. This guy right now wants you to die in apocalyptic hellfire, all right? If this guy's political prescriptions, if this guy's narrative, his mode of analysis, is one which leads to all the world should just be divvied up between the superpowers, whichever countries have the nukes to defend themselves, and countries should not commit to strategic assets that they're not willing to end the world over should it be challenged by another country with nukes. This mindset will end the world. I think that he's actually misrepresenting China quite a bit because it's really obvious that China's attempts at becoming a superpower have been predicated largely on trade blocs and economic hegemony, as opposed to Russia's, which are literally just about military expansionism, which is a relatively 19th century mindset. I feel like China has advanced significantly in that respect and has a pretty modern, even maybe more modern approach than we do to the way in which they extend geopolitical power. But make no mistake, guys, do you guys want to live forever in a world where smaller countries that don't have nukes are carved up by larger countries that do, and that there's never any way of remedying the situation ever? Because any country that has strategic assets that they're willing to die for, it just has like the ultimate nuke button. Like, no. Very, very clearly, nuclear colonialism is not the solution to the world's problems. I have no idea what kind of fucking psychopath would think that it is. Very obviously, the way to solve the world's problems with regards to nuclear proliferation is to A, promote democracy, to B, make the interests of the government more or less aligned with the interests of the population, which C, does not want to be nuked to death, whereas the ultra-wealthy either as individuals may not care because they're psychopaths, or B, because they're Passatists, or C, because they're anti-natalist, or D, because they just built themselves an Elon Musk space shuttle to Mars. So we promote democracy, and then we promote economic interdependence, okay? And that will significantly decrease the likelihood of war. This attitude that he has, I think, is a very, very destructive one. Very destructive.
NATO, when we have now acknowledged by not taking military action over Ukraine that it's not a vital strategic interest. You understand that when you incorporate Ukraine into NATO, you're giving them an Article 5 guarantee, which says you'll come to their defense if they're attacked. You only give Article 5 guarantees to countries that are of vital strategic interest, like Germany during the Cold War.
Like Estonia? Is Estonia of vital security interest to America? I mean, don't get me wrong, I've heard Estonia has some cool stuff, but I mean, I don't think they're essential. But yeah, that's the point. Small countries shouldn't be bullied by big countries. That's a good thing, I hope.
What were we doing? Thinking about giving an Article 5 guarantee to a country that's not a vital strategic interest. It just shows you how discombobulated American foreign policy is these days. And of course,
I like how reality doesn't conform to this guy's analysis. So his response isn't that his analysis is faulty, it's that America's doing reality wrong.
The Ukraine crisis is just one of many messes that we've made. As you know, we have the Midas touch in reverse.
How did we make it?
It doesn't go south. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, I could go on.
Oh, yeah. Iraq and Ukraine. One country we invaded with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and another country we didn't at all. We did nothing like that. What the fuck? Dude, how do people listen to this shit? If anyone out there is capable of coming on here and defending any of these positions, but like, they can't, man. Squirrel was defending this shit on Twitter, but Squirrel doesn't do live stream chat, so that's never going to happen. Like no one can defend this. I will win a debate on this against anyone. There's no human on earth I would lose this to, okay? We need to fucking Voltron this shit. Put all the greatest realist international relations scholars together. Merge their bodies into some kind of fucking 20-person homunculus, okay? And give them a mic, all right? Give me something, all right? I don't understand. I don't get it. Debate Chomsky? I don't want to debate Chomsky. He would talk like one word a minute. I would feel bad.
So the point I'm making to you is...
Wait. NATO creep after 1990 was crucial to popularizing expansionist sentiment in Russia. I think you can recognize that fact without giving justification to Putin's actions or making a specific policy. Yeah, okay, but I don't think... Like, what you're saying is an authoritarian government used the information available to them in order to manufacture a narrative to engage in expansionist logic. Would you then use that as a defense of them? Like, can America do that? Like the invasion of Iraq? Well, you know, 9/11 was crucial to popularizing expansionist sentiments in America. Like, if you want to have in a purely descriptive sense, the expansion of NATO may have contributed to Russia's behavior, you can, but like, that's like, as far as I'm concerned, that's like saying, you know, well, objectively speaking, the low cut of that woman's skirt did contribute to her getting raped and killed in an alleyway. Like, you can play that logic if you want, but as a man concerned with ethics, as an upstanding, you know, ethics-loving guy, I'm actually really concerned with what's right and wrong, not just which things lead to which other things.
I do not think that this is going to work, but if it does work, I'm not sure it's a good thing. I had some quotes from the New York Times that really capture what we're doing. I won't leave them up there, but they make it very clear that we're playing hardball with the Russians.
That's the problem. Realism doesn't take into account ethics. Yeah, I know.
Version of the Obama.
Except it does, because this guy's presupposing certain ethical conclusions by saying that government should act in the self-interest that he seems to think they're not currently acting in. He is making prescriptive statements. He literally just said that America is fucking up by not doing or by doing certain things. He's clearly prescribing stuff. It's just the thing that he cares about is making the world conform to his batshit fucking international relations model and not, preventing the harm of civilians. His ethical principle is post hoc maximizing the resemblance between his international relations model and the world. And mine is, ideally promoting human well-being and also animal well-being,
Administration's thinking on how to deal with this crisis. Now, what should be done? My view is we should create a neutral Ukraine, which is a buffer state between NATO and Russia. Basically, what I'm talking about is going back to the status.
No, realism is focused on limiting war. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not. They say it is, while he constantly downplays Russian military aggression, but it's not.
Status quo ante. Before we got this foolish idea in our head that we could peel Ukraine away from Russia and make it part of NATO, make it part of the EU, make it more generally part of the West. We should work to create a situation where Ukraine is neutral, and it's a buffer state.
There's no such thing as a neutral buffer state next to Russia.
Simple or simplistic graphic, depending on your views, right? This is how I think about European security. This is what you want. You want NATO to include France, Germany, and Poland. You want Ukraine as a buffer state, and then you want Russia on the eastern flank of the border state.
Just tens of millions of people.
This is not what you want. You do not
no
want
freedom.
a divided
Okay.
Ukraine where Western Ukraine is in NATO, Eastern Ukraine is in Russia, and the Russians and the Americans who hate each other at that point are eyeball to eyeball on the Dnieper River. Not a good idea. How do you get to this end? Very simple.
Yeah, does Ukraine get a say in this?
By the way, NATO expansion is dead. I've talked to countless policymakers.
It's about preventing war between great powers. Realists are totally fine with war if it's a great power attacking whatever small powers they want. So here's the question no one has been able to answer for me. What happens when Ukraine's buffer state status gets fucked over by Russia just invading them, and then they conquer Ukraine, and now Russia is once again eyeballing NATO countries? Buffer states don't happen. There's no such thing as a real buffer state. You realize that, right? It doesn't actually work anymore. Buffer states have to be able to defend themselves against both sides. You think Ukraine can defend itself against NATO and Russia? It doesn't work. They'll just conquer the territory. It's like with North Korea. Yeah, but North Korea has nukes. So it can defend itself against invasion. Also, I'm pretty sure that if North Korea ever actually did anything to disrupt Chinese interests too much, like China would just kind of like quietly replace it. Where should NATO expansion stop in your opinion? I don't care where it stops. I really do not think that NATO like causes harm that wouldn't be caused by the autonomous militaries of these countries. It's a defensive pact. Asking this again, Vosh, do you think Russia should be invading Ukraine if Ukraine wasn't on the road to joining NATO? Sort of feel like this important? Yes, 100%. Absolutely, without a doubt. I think that the existence of NATO and its potential expansion is just a pretext that they're using, but Russia is very clearly comfortable lying to build support for their military engagement all the time. If this was genuinely just about NATO, why the constant false flags? Why the constant dishonesty? No, I do not believe in what is essentially geopolitical victim blaming, where one set of countries doing things that are morally right is actually wrong because that leads to the other countries doing something that is morally wrong, Ukraine has a right to be in NATO if it wants. Russia does not have a right to invade if they want. Yeah, Ukraine only wants to join NATO because of Russia. That's the thing, guys. Remember, NATO doesn't pose a threat to Russia. Why don't they invade Belarus? Because Belarus is a puppet of Russia. Why would they need to? NATO cannot invade Russia. The only actual thing they're worried about blocking off is economic access. But guys, Ukraine choosing to trade with the EU instead would also block off economic access to Russia. So even then, a buffer state doesn't work for Russia because autonomous decision-making that Ukraine can engage in, even if they're not part of NATO, would be sufficient to fuck over Russia. You understand? So hypothetically, if every country but Russia was in NATO, would you see it as a threat in any way? To Russia? No. In effect, all that would be is a shared, like, trade bloc. They couldn't invade Russia. No country can invade Russia. It cannot happen. Even economically? Yeah, of course economically, but the economic threat's happening anyway. Yeah, the number of white names in chat is an economic threat to me. True.
Makers who say this, it's dead. But what we have to do is explicitly abandon it. Say it is not happening. We have to fashion an economic rescue plan for Ukraine that includes Russia, the IMF, and the EU. This, of course, is what Putin wanted to do in 2013, and the EU said no, foolishly. We want to go to great lengths to guarantee minority rights, especially language rights in Ukraine. This gets back to those maps that...
Oh, now this guy cares about ethics. Oh, wow. Earlier, he didn't really care about any of the ethical implications of Russia's behavior, but now when the United States or the EU or NATO does something that he like thinks is morally wrong, he's keen to point it out. That's crazy.
...that I was putting up that show that this is in very important ways a civil war, and what we have to do is dampen down the conflict inside Ukraine.
Oh my god, I can see all the people who are new to chat. How do you call NATO a defensive pact when, oh yeah, don't spam or the bot will mute you, when Libya and when Yugoslavia? That's why I said I don't think they do anything that their constituent nation states couldn't do on their own. Trust me, if there wasn't a NATO, do you still think that the European nations wouldn't have intervened in Yugoslavia? Don't be ridiculous, okay? And with Libya, likewise. NATO is just a framework through which they engage in this action, but they could have done it without it. I don't think NATO as an institution did anything to facilitate that behavior. The only thing NATO explicitly facilitates is the defensive clause. But all that shit still would have happened. Like, England, France, what have you, these countries engage in imperialist action with the United States all the time. They don't need NATO to do it. It still happens. Yeah, France was the most aggressive in Libya.
We have to give the people in eastern Ukraine a lot of autonomy, and we definitely have to protect minority rights. Are we going to do any of this? No. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Consequences. And this is my last slide. Will there be a new Cold War? No. Russia is not the Soviet Union, and as I said to you before, we have a potential peer competitor on the horizon who could be of proportions we've never seen before. The Chinese threat, once it materializes, is going to be something like we've never seen. We're going to have our hands full in Asia. Europe is not going to matter. And Russia is going to be with us. The balancing coalition against China is going to be South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, Singapore, India, and Russia. The Russians will be with us. And that's another reason this whole policy...
Wrong. Yugoslavian bombing campaign was specifically meant to give justification to the continued existence of NATO after Yeltsin. I genuinely think that would have happened either way, and just doing it under the frame of NATO was a way for them to maintain the posture of NATO being some kind of essential European peacekeeping force. I genuinely think that what happened in Yugoslavia probably would have played out the same way. Also, I'm not gonna lie, dude. I get so fucking sussy. I get such sussy vibes from people who talk about, like, as though the thing that went wrong in Yugoslavia was NATO. I gotta tell you guys, okay? Pretty objectively, NATO was maybe, like, the 8th worst thing happening in that part of the world at that time, okay? Just, it's very, like, by a large... significant metric. I don't know. People overstate this shit. Yeah, the genocide was a little bit bad. It was a little bad. It was a little not good.
Policy is so stupid, right? What we're effectively doing is driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. There's a great strategy. We need the Russians on Iran. We need the Russians on Iran. We drive the Russians.
I'm gonna kill myself. Aren't you utilitarian if you acknowledge that NATO expansion has provided cause for Russian expansion? Shouldn't you oppose it on moral grounds? No, that's not how utilitarianism works. That's like saying that we should promote all women wearing burqas so they get raped less often. Maybe there's another cause. Maybe appeasement isn't an effective way of dealing with dictators. We made a mistake back in 2008 when we backed off Ukraine in the way we did. We should have been more explicit supporters of Ukraine from the get-go. No, like, this is appeasement logic. Well, don't you think, like, Hitler claims he'll stop if et cetera, so should we? No. Also, Russia would have fabricated pretext anyway. They lie about everything. We should never, ever trust Russia. Ever. Never trust Russia. Sorry, 2014, not 2008. Never trust Russia, okay? Ever. They lie about everything all the time. Their government policy is to lie. What? They don't need NATO expansion. If they wanted to, they could convince their population that NATO is expanding anyway. Also, NATO doesn't even fucking threaten them. No. No.
Russians closer to the Iranians. You saw where they just sold the Iranians S-300 anti-aircraft missiles. We need the Russians on Syria. We need the Russians on all sorts of issues. We don't need to have a fight with the Russians now. We're not going to have a Cold War. Will the United States still pivot to Asia? Yes. All we need is one big crisis out there. It's coming, probably in the South China Sea sooner rather than later, if you've been reading the newspapers. And once that happens, we will focus laser-like on Asia, because that's a peer competitor. Russia is not a peer competitor. What are the implications for NATO? This gets back to the previous question. I think that NATO is in serious trouble and will disappear as a functioning alliance over time, in large part because I think we're going to pivot to Asia. What are the implications of all this for our Asian allies? It's a very interesting question. I was in Japan in December of 2000.
The French say President Macron, President Biden, and President Putin held a joint call tonight where Macron proposed a summit between Putin and Biden, which the French said the two agreed to in principle. It can only be held if Russia does not invade Ukraine. Okay, that's not very much. They agree to have a summit in principle? That's pretty weak.
2014. And the Japanese, like a lot of people in Asia, number one, wonder whether we're going to be there for them, right? Because they see us causing trouble over Ukraine. They see us picking a fight with ISIS. And they say if the United States is fighting ISIS, dealing with the Russians over Ukraine, are they going to be able to pivot to Asia? And then furthermore, they say,
what?
Even if the United States does pivot, can we trust them? If you look at how this gang operates in Washington, it does look like the gang that can't shoot straight. Do we want to depend on them? If you're Japanese and you're depending on the American security umbrella, especially the American nuclear umbrella, don't you scratch your head and say, can I rely on...
I'm so sorry. This guy might have access to information that I don't have, but what the fuck is he talking about? How does us having people fighting ISIS mean Japan wouldn't trust us? We don't have a... What? Japan's all the way across the Pacific from us. That's the whole other... I don't... Maybe there's something here that I don't get. I don't know.
Washington in a crunch with the Chinese over the Senkaku or Diao Islands? Not clear. So I think this has not been good for our relations with our Asian allies. What are the implications for Iran and Syria? As I said before, remains to be seen. We need the Russians on Iran. We need the Russians on Syria. And
he's saying the U.S. can't fight two battles at once. What battles? Who's going to invade Japan? Is that a thing? Is that a thing? Does Japan even have nukes? No, I don't think they do.
You take a stick and you poke the Russians in the eye, and you continue to poke them in the eye, they're going to look for ways to retaliate. And I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the road they don't play ball with us on Iran. We don't get a deal with the Iranians. It'd be interesting to see what the Russians then do. See if they're interested in maintaining a sanctions regime. And Syria is a total mess, as you know, and if there's any hope of resolving that, the Russians are going to have to be involved.
They briefly had two.
It's going to be hard to get a lot of cooperation, given what's going on over Ukraine.
They're our first strike weapon. Oh, wait, yeah, you're right. They don't need to have nukes. We have nukes. In Japan. That's true, yeah. Wait, who's going to invade Japan? We have nukes in Japan. China? China's not going to invade Japan.
Is Crimea lost to Russia for good?
Wait, we don't have nukes in Japan? Wait, I'm pretty sure we do have first strike capabilities in Japan. Just a second. Japan, U.S. base, first strike. Somebody in chat said that, and it reminded me that I'm pretty sure that's true, but let me see. U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan. Stored secretly following World War II until 1972. Oh, no, we pulled them out? Okay, gotcha. We removed them, okay. We still have nuclear subs in Guam? Okay, gotcha. It doesn't really matter. Our missiles can reach across the world. I don't know. It just seems dumb. I don't think anyone's going to nuke Japan. Seems dumb.
Yep, it's gone. Gone. What are the implications for Ukraine? This is in many ways the most important part of my talk, and I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes, then we can go to Q&A. When I give this talk, many people in the West...
Vosh, by your logic, there will never be a war, non-proxy war between great powers. I have no idea what you mean. How involved do you think NATO was in the attempted false flag of the Ukrainian kindergarten? Not. I don't think we have NATO troops in the Donbass region, because if we did, somebody would have caught them on video, and Russia already would have used this as a pretext for invasion.
I think that there's sort of a deep-seated immoral dimension to my position, because I'm blaming the West and not Putin, who certainly has authoritarian or thuggish tendencies. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine...
He only said thuggish because Putin is black.
Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. Well, as I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis.
If it is happening right now, do you think it'd be fun to have this guy's audio up in the background so we can hear him talk about how as long as NATO's not in Ukraine, Ukrainians will be safe? While we're like going over. Hold on, I need an official confirmation of some kind.
Crisis. Thank you.
We'll listen until... Oh. Q&A then.
They have a microphone for you.
And there stood Hans Morgenthau, right before you, for those of us who knew. Okay, so many questions and points. First, point of information. When you talk about the gang in Washington, you need to make it clear, hopefully, that you don't mean only the present gang. You mean from at least 2008 forward, right?
Yeah, I mean the whole Washington foreign policy establishment.
Right.
Republicans, Democrats. As far as I'm concerned, the Republicans and the Democrats on foreign policy are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Right.
I mean, for anybody who thinks it matters whether you get Hillary Clinton or some Republican, you're living in a dream world. There's just no meaningful difference between them. They both have the Midas touch in reverse.
That leads to my second question. Is anybody listening to you and Stephen Cohen and partial, what's the one I want? The Kissinger, partial Kissinger, Stephen Cohen, and you. Is anybody listening that we could hope to vote for or support?
No.
I don't know. No one. So, and I'm going to give this up in a moment.
No.
But so there's no one. So we really do.
Keep in mind it's at 1.4 times speed. This guy just talks slow.
That's it, right? Okay. I mean, there's no enlightenment in store. We can't even
Can
look
I
toward
just say something, just in response to your question? I believe that since 1989, the United States has been by far the most powerful state on the planet. And for those of you who believe we live in a unipolar world, you're effectively saying that we are the only great power in the system. And given that tremendous amount of power that we have, we're really free to go out and do all sorts of foolish things because it doesn't blow back on us in any meaningful way. The United States is a remarkably secure great power. So we're allowed to pursue these foolish policies. And in that context, it's very hard to make arguments against the establishment that carry the day. I think what will happen if China continues to rise is that it will force the United States to think more strategically. Because when you live in a serious threat environment...
Yeah, that you guys keep linking me tweets which relate to an earlier statement from today, talking about how the U.S. intelligence sources claim that they've been given the order to invade. But that's not the same as the CBS guy saying they've just been told to invade. News of unidentified U.S. intelligence sources in Ukraine, otherwise known as Russia can invade in 45 minutes. I think this is the same thing. The article is old. The post is new. Keep calm.
The point I'm making to you is that the United States does not live in a serious threat environment. We're an incredibly secure country. We're the most secure country, most secure great power in the history of the world, and we're more secure today than we have ever been in our entire history. Despite all the rhetoric that you hear from Washington and in the media about how dangerous the world is, this is just not a serious argument. It's not a dangerous world, right? We are incredibly secure. We have a peer competitor. It'll force us to focus the mind, much the way happened when the Soviet Union was there, Nazi Germany was there, Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany.
Really enjoyed your lecture. I have two questions briefly. It's hard to take issue with the goal of a neutral Ukraine, but some years before the crisis broke out, I used to listen to RUI, which was Radio Ukraine International on shortwave.
Wait, this is different. Guys, this isn't just on a convoy. This is in its firing position. It's off the road, and the soldiers cleared the snow. That's got to be facing Ukraine right now, isn't it? Yeah,